We'll be discussing Sally Morgan's 1987 piece entitled Citizenship. I'll start off by providing some legal context and background. Up until January 1949, all Australians, including Indigenous Australians, were British subjects. The Nationality and Citizenship Act extended citizenship to all Australians. However, in Western Australia, Indigenous Australians were not given citizenship. Instead, they had to apply to become citizens of their own country. This was resulting from the Natives Citizenship Rights Act 1944. Without citizenship, Indigenous Australians were not treated as equals under the law. The application process required numerous conditions, including proof that they had severed ties with their Aboriginal family and friends, they were free from disease, they could speak English, they had been civilised in behaviour for the last 2 years, they could manage their affairs and were industrious in their habits. A successful applicant was no longer seen to be a native or an Aboriginal. This certificate of citizenship could be taken away for a number of reasons, including if they were seen to have rejected civilised life, had been convicted twice of any felony, they were found drunk, or had contracted a disease such as leprosy or syphilis. Citizenship was also able to be revoked, resulting from a complaint to the court from any member of the public. This citizenship was also not passed down to the children of Indigenous citizens. These children would have to go through the process of applying when they were adults. Indigenous Australians viewed the certificate of citizenship as akin to a derogatory dog licence. As noted in the text provided, after one man was refused service of alcohol, he wrote, "I will not buy a dog collar in Western Australia to put around my neck to become a citizen of one state. A man better without it." The successful 1967 referendum did not repeal this law either. It was only repealed in 1971.
I'll be discussing the social context and gaze of this piece. Sally Morgan is a Paliku and Nyama woman born in Perth in 1951. She was raised to be unaware of her Aboriginal heritage, owing to her mother and grandmother's feelings of repressed shame and trauma. They told Sally to tell her peers that she was of Indian descent to protect her from the racism they had experienced. In an interview, Sally says her peers accepted this lie, as their problem with her skin colour was that they just didn't want her pretending to be Australian when she wasn't. This will be an apt memory to recall when further analysing citizenship. After considerable effort, Sally uncovered the truth of her family's background and decided to self-identify as Aboriginal out of respect to her grandmother Daisy. This screen print was made for the Right Here, Right Now Australia 1988 exhibition, which aimed to cast a different light on the bicentennial celebrations of the arrival of the First Fleet. In thinking about this context and the legal background Felix has discussed, the gaze of this print is a good place to start. The dog depicted in Citizenship is a strong figure, but whose eyes convey the surprise and vacancy we associated with the phrase, "a deer caught in the headlights." As a representative of Aboriginal people about whom these laws were made, this is a moment in which all the dog's attention is directed to its internal thought. We related this to the impossibility of making Aboriginal people citizens of their own land, and their own difficulty in being able to comprehend that they now formally belong to country. We saw this print not just part of Sally's own journey in discovering her family's traumatic past, but as part of Australia's journey in coming to terms with its national shame.
I'm Anjali, and I'll be discussing Morgan's choice to depict a dog wearing a collar to represent Aboriginal Australians. This choice effectively demonstrates the degradation Indigenous Australians faced when applying for the Certificate of Exemption. Not only did the certificate belittle their heritage, it also attempted to erase their cultural identity. Indigenous Australians were dehumanised and were encouraged to feel lesser than the British. In essence, they were made to feel no better than animals. The dog collar is also highly symbolic. Dogs do not wear tags for the benefit of other dogs, but are made to wear tags for the benefit of humans. The dogs themselves have no choice in the matter. Similarly, the Aboriginal people were forced to obtain a certificate of exemption not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the British. However, an alternative reading of this image alludes to the defiance towards conformity. Dogs occupy a spiritual role in Aboriginal culture, often representing ancestors. Thus, the dog evokes the ancestral ties the Aboriginal people have to their native land, something not shared by the British, who do not have similar attachments to Australia. Moreover, the dog may be wearing a collar, but he is also painted in tribal patterns. We believe this to be an indication that despite the best efforts of the West, aspects of culture and heritage that are so intrinsic to an Aboriginal person's identity can never be erased.
I will be discussing how the artwork can also be analysed through Panofsky's consideration of the icon, iconography, and iconology as the 3 stages of visual studies. The image as an icon can be understood through its simplistic cartoon-like style and the messages it conveys, which we will return to in our video. This interpretation of the artwork as an icon also extends to its immediate contents, most notably the stars and the dog. The iconography of the dog in particular is grounded in what the dog represents, some of which we've already discussed. However, its iconographical function also lies in its resemblance to the jackal-headed Anubis. Anubis was the ancient Egyptian god of the afterlife, responsible for judging the dead and ensuring eternal justice. To this end, Anubis is perhaps best recognized as kneeling, holding a pair of scales to weigh the hearts of the dead and determine their passage in the afterlife. What is the social and cultural significance of this representation, and what does it tell us about what was happening in Western Australia? On an iconological level, it connects Anubis, the just and eternal judge, with the ordeals of Aboriginal people being made to apply and qualify for citizenship in their own land. This speaks to the degrading experience of a colonial legal system being the judge, holding the scales to weigh and decide whether Aboriginal people could be considered Australian or not.
I'll be discussing how Sally Morgan utilises text within the artwork itself. First, consider the literal meaning of the text. As we have previously mentioned, Indigenous Australians have suffered bitterly throughout the history of colonial Australia, and this is referenced explicitly by Sally Morgan in Citizenship. Traditionally, text and subsequently the law has been a medium for command and control, for creating a society based upon shared ideals. By intentionally including this paragraph within her artwork, Sally Morgan highlights that the historical Australian citizenship laws function by othering Aboriginal people and essentially excluding them from this society that law and text is supposed to foster. Sally Morgan's choice of legalistic words is also interesting. The use of the word license often carries connotations of permission, grant, or granting of authority. For example, the ability to have a driver's license to drive a car or license to sell alcohol. To us, these are generally positive. However, the Indigenous Australian experience creates a very different connotation of this control and restriction. This demonstrates that even text, much like icon and images, can have different effects depending upon the socio-political context. Second, consider Sally Morgan's choice of location for the text within citizenship. Located at the bottom of the artwork, it draws us to make connections between the relative importance of text and image. Imaginational representations of the law take primacy over the text of the law as a representation of power. Sally Morgan's artwork and the positioning of the image and text highlights this important relationship between text and the icon when it tells a story of how the law applies to Indigenous Australians. Further, in many ways, this style and formatting of citizenship could also be seen to mimic the graphic-like quality of editorial cartoons and newspapers. These cartoons have a controversial history of commenting on socio-political issues, and perhaps Sally Morgan drew inspiration from this. Despite the cartoon-like quality of the work, she addresses a very serious subject matter.
A strong feature of Morgan's citizenship is the colour choice to use only black and white. We saw that the choice to have a black background with white etching of the features symbolises a race issue of white supremacy in Australian colonial history, which touches on the division of society from the implementation of colonial law, where the law only sees people as black or white. The dog tag in this piece represents this, as you see the stark contrast of the white tag on the black dog, making it very clear of the label Australian citizen, which can also symbolise that even if Aboriginal people were recognised as citizens, they are still relegated to a colour. Furthermore, the significance of this piece is the relevancy it has held throughout time. This piece can almost present itself as a symptom of the cultural challenges that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders has faced throughout Australian history and society. And just to quickly wrap up this presentation, we wanted to turn your attention to the stars and leave you with the question, what do you think is the effect of the stars? In our discussion, there was not one single agreed viewpoint, which led us to believe that the effect of the stars are defined by your own internal and emotional perceptions. And so we ask you this question as it is something certainly worth discussing.